Rome, Italy. The eternal city where empires rise and fall, and from ashes new ones are born again. We are here on hallowed ground, this castle, the summer residence of Pope Pius V. In 1571, the Pope stood on this balcony and declared an end to the Battle of Lepanto, effectively bringing an end to the Crusades. Today, this place is home to the Link Campus University, a learning institution focused on foreign policy and international relations. And Europe again is in the grips of crisis. Millions of refugees fleeing war, tyranny and poverty are now banging on Europe's door, with those seeking a better life facing abuse, exploitation, even slavery. On the choppy waters of the Mediterranean and the chilly streets of Europe's capitals, we've traced the roots. So now join me for the CNN Freedom Project, Solutions to End Human Trafficking, inside the European migration crisis. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to this special Freedom Project program tonight as we look at this unique aspect of the migration crisis and how it's affecting Europe at the moment. The solutions, the possibilities, the problems, all will be dealt with over the next hour. And so, let us meet the people who are going to put into perspective the exact nature of this current crisis. Joining us this evening, we have Franco Frattini, the former Italian Foreign Minister. We have Julie Oka-Donnelly, the Director General of NAPTIP, Nigeria's anti-trafficking agency. Gervais Apave, the Special Policy Advisor to the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. You'll hear us refer to that organization as the IOM throughout the course of this evening. And Joanna Rubinstein, the Chief Executive of the World Childhood Foundation USA, who is with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, on this subject, at this time, there are no finer that can help us understand what is happening. Our panel this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Gervais Apave, we start with you, sir. 5 decades of dealing with this situation. Let's start with who is going where.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all refer to the term which is in the title of the forum, slavery. I use this term because it's a global term which is very confusing to many people. Is there modern slavery today? They ask, surely it belongs to the 19th century. Well, it doesn't. According to the latest statistics which have been produced, they came out quite recently, there are some 40 million slaves around the world. Roughly 25 million of these people are trapped in what I'd call forced labor. 15 million of these are in forced marriages. So within these people who are categorized under the forced labor label, there are many migrants.
What do you mean by migrants in this sense?
Good. In this sense, they're people who've crossed an international border and who have become trapped into the trafficking business. Now, let me talk a few words about trafficking. What is that? It is essentially a trade in human beings. It is the exploitation of people through coercion, through deception, through aggression, and they end up being deprived of their freedom and choice. And at that moment, they're under the control of the traffickers. So it's people who are under the control of a trade we call the trafficking trade.
Julia, let us look at the issue of where. Now, one aspect of the where is where they are coming from, and the numbers suggest that there are large numbers coming from your country, from Nigeria. In fact, the largest number in this current range of crisis. You'd agree with that? Why are they coming?
Like he said, there are various factors. We have the situation where poverty is a factor. Sometimes the idea that there's better life on the other side. Sometimes through fraud, deception. People give them, these traffickers give the impression that, oh, you're going to get a very good job. Some are actually abducted. Sometimes you're going to school and you're kidnapped on the way to school and you find yourself in a country that you know nothing about. It's a trade. So there are various factors.
I am guessing that there are many of our guests here, myself included, Joanna, that find it absolutely inconceivable that somebody gets kidnapped on the way to school and basically sold into a life of sex slavery. But you're going to tell me I'm wrong, aren't you?
Yes and no. It depends which country we are talking about. What happens is that some of them are actually kidnapped when they already made it to their destination. A lot of the migrant children who are more on the move on their own, unaccompanied minor, they reach countries like my own, Sweden, and they are being kidnapped by traffickers. They suddenly find a person who is speaking their own language. If they come, for example, from Libya, or if they come from Morocco, they speak Arabic. Someone who is nice to them tells them that don't trust this government, and they flee because they don't trust the government, and they get kidnapped. And they disappear already into trafficking in the country where they arrived.
The countries involved that are on the receiving end of these migrants initially, and thereby trafficked migrants, one of the big ones is Italy. And former Minister, we are very pleased that you're here because you can give us the Italian perspective.
This is phenomena that have a common human component, but the common denominator is there is the total denegation of one of the basic fundamental rights of human beings. This is the point that unites migrants, refugees, those that are kidnapped, those that are victims of trafficking.
Why are they coming to Italy? Is it because Italy happens to be on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea from Libya and it's the easiest way to get there?
Yeah, on one hand, because Italy is the easiest way to reach Europe. When they reach the Sicilian shores, they are on the European territory. There was some 10 years ago similar flows of migrants reaching Spain, reaching Canary Island. At that time, this was the easiest way. They changed the way depending on business, depending on routes, depending on trafficking routes.
The issue, of course, is one of what to do about it, and where does leadership come in all of this? And for that, we are very pleased to have with us Monsignor Marcello Sanchez Sorondo, who is here. Now, the Monsignor is the Chancellor for the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and Sciences. The Vatican has been a consistent and outspoken advocate against human trafficking. So, Monsignor, tell us, if you'd be so kind, what the Vatican believes it can do in a real sense, besides saying something must be done.
Well, first of all, was the Pope Benedict to speak about the new form of slaves, and especially prostitution. This is a great crime against humanity, and he speaks especially from his country. And after Pope Francis, immediately, that was choice, Pope, he write a letter to me, Marcello, I want that you, the Academy, study the questions of the new form of slaves as forced labor, prostitution, and traffic of organs. And we organized a meeting with the more important leaders, religious leaders, And all these religious leaders, from the more important religions, was the Anglicans, was the Hindus, was, of course, the Jews, and the two traditions of Muslims say, in the name of God, this is a crime against humanity.
What role does religion play, or organized religion play?
So
to
after
help?
this, I think that in this subject, all the religions can act together, because it's not easy to act together, for example, to pray, because we have different ideas, but to defend the human dignity, to defend freedom, this is a project from freedom, to defend peace, I think this is fundamental today.
Next, let us examine and now start to pull this apart. Let us go further involved and more detailed. And let us start with, of course, the question of exactly where these migrants are coming from and why. The issue of where these migrants are coming from is, of course, fundamental to understanding the nature of the problem. How we can deal with it can only truly be understood once you've understood why they've left their home countries in the first place. And for that, we turn to CNN's Our Damon.
Blessing blows on a leaf and places it on a bottle. She's come to the chief priest to guarantee safe passage to Italy. The ritual will culminate in a juju oath, where she'll pledge to repay the cost of travel to her sponsor in Europe. She has put all her trust in her sponsor and her faith. And it's a potent combination that has sent a record number of Nigerian women to Europe. The International Organization for Migration estimates that in 2014, around 1,400 traveled. This past year, the numbers spiked to 11,000. The vast majority come from here, Benin City, where the economy runs on remittances from abroad, and women are regularly approached with false promises. Sandra is talking about her deputy pastor, who told her he had a vision from God that she traveled overseas. Then he said his sister in Russia could get her a job in a hair salon. Sandra went willingly, but for added insurance, he took items from her.
My pants, my bra, the hair from my head, my armpit, and my private part. He said that it's a form of agreement, so that when I get there, I'm not going to run with the money.
When she arrived in Russia, the sum was more than she could have ever imagined.
But the first thing she did, she took away my passport. That unless I finish paying her money, $45,000.
$45,000.
Yes, that's what she said.
And the only way to pay that off was prostitution. Bound by the spirits in a strange city, for the next 3 years, Sandra's life was hell. She lost count of the men per night, at times 10, 15, 20, even more.
And at that process, most of Nigerian girls lost their life, because it's not every girl that can withstand the pressure of 10 men.
But she didn't go to the authorities. The trafficker had given the items he took from her to a priest in Nigeria. And like so many, she was afraid of the power of the juju.
It's like a danger to we girls, so we're very careful. Mostly when it has to do with the sensitive parts of your body, they might use it against you.
It took Sandra 3 years to pay off the debt.
The wicked don't have any place here. They have to face the law.
When she got back to Benin City, she reported the man and his sister who trafficked her, and they are now on trial. She's publicizing her ordeal so that others don't have to go through it, turning her nightmare into power.
Our Damon reporting there. Julie, first question to you. Why is there this pipeline from Nigeria up through North Africa, out towards Libya, and then across to Italy?
At the beginning, the girls from Benin City were going to Italy for prostitution, and they seemed to be thriving in the business. And so when the criminal gangs saw there was so much money in the business of prostitution, they began human trafficking. The reason why so many people come from Benin City is because those who started the business there were now engaged in the business of human trafficking. They were made to deceive their brothers, their sisters, friends, and relations, and that is why they kept coming under duress.
You keep saying they deceive. They deceive about what?
About good business in Italy. They gave them the impression they were coming to get good jobs in Italy, not prostitution.
How many of these migrants do you think, Gervais, how many end up either trafficked or in, for want of some of the sort of seedy circumstances that Julie has outlined?
As it so happens, we've just done a survey of 22,000 migrants who came across the Mediterranean. And 73% of them indicated that they had been subjected to a form of abuse, of exploitation amounting to trafficking.
Yes, it is absolutely clear. European Commission published years ago a report showing that roughly 85% of children and young girls that are victims of trafficking are victims of real European business, not only in Italian business. Thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of children and young girls.
So, forgive my naivete in this, but I can hear viewers looking at the screen saying, how on earth does one of the leading EU nations end up in this situation? How does it happen, and how come you can't stop it?
It happens that there is unfortunately a close link between those traffickers and organized crime in Italy.
So you're saying there's a mafia element here?
Absolutely. Like mafia style. It is not properly mafia, but is organized crime working with the method of mafia and organized crime groups.
As we continue, we're going to look at next the journey. We've seen where they've come from, we've seen why, and we've seen where they're going. But what about the actual journey, which we'll consider next? The issue of trafficking, really, you have to get down to the absolute nitty-gritty. There is nothing elegant or pleasant about this, and we have to look at the actual journey by which many of these migrants, who eventually then become trafficked migrants, the journey that they take. We're delighted tonight to have with us the Italian Coast Guard, who have provided video, shocking video that it's going to be difficult, perhaps, to watch. But you need to see it, and you need to comment after on what we're about to watch.
Hello, this is Italian Coast Guard.
Yes, we are in there for Red Cross. We called about 30 minutes ago.
Okay, I take you only, okay, I take you only the rest.
Gervais.
Yes. What we're seeing here is a perfect illustration of what I call the triple jeopardy in which migrants find themselves. Julie has talked about the first jeopardy, which is being terrorized at the point of departure and falling into a trap. This is the second part of the journey, which is all about the maximization of profit. Traffickers want to make the most money and will push them onto those fragile embarkations by the hundreds, by the thousands. What matters is the money they make. And of course, at the end, as Mr. Frattini has said, there's the triple jeopardy awaiting them at destination.
The numbers and of incidents that you've seen like this in 5 decades, we're horrified by what we've just seen. You're looking at it and thinking, this is normal in that sense.
There is a terrible normality about it, an awful normality, that traffickers are organized. This is a traffic in the real sense of the word. This is an industry. This is commercial.
Yeah, they have also a well-rooted organization. They have satellite phones. They have people moving from a bigger boat to a smaller boat in the high seas. So that happens because there are many complicities in the transit countries, in the destination countries, in the origin countries. I'm very proud because the Italian Coast Guard and the police forces saved so many human lives, by the way.
It is worth me saying to you, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for the work you do, and thank you for allowing us to see the life-saving work that you do. Barney Nadal, you cover this, you deal with this as part of your daily business. When you see this and you see what Italy is facing with this, what do you make?
Well, I just spent 2 weeks out on an NGO ship that does a similar rescue, and there were 77 young women from Nigeria on a boat full of 588 people. They were 14, 15, 16 years old. It was an organized situation. They were being escorted by older Nigerian women. And when you know this trafficking cycle, as we've heard described, and you see it, you feel like there's something you should do at that moment. But as you see in that video, in that image, these young people have just been saved from the sea. It is not the moment you say to them, listen, you're being trafficked for sex, you're being sold into slavery. There is such a fear in their faces. It's not the time to say to them. It's before they get on the boat that the trafficking needs to stop, not when they get on the boat. And there's a misconception about at what point in the cycle they can be helped.
How do you go home back to your comfortable bed after being out there and seeing those people?
It's tremendously difficult. I have to say, I haven't slept great since I got back because of the faces of those young women, especially the babies, the children, the families who have been saved, possibly for a life in many ways worse than death for a lot of them.
Joanna, you know that many of those, dare I say most of those young women, tell me what's going to happen to them.
They are perhaps going to be used initially as maids, and they are going to be used. They're going to be sold. They are not going to get a better life. I think one thing that was illustrated on that boat was not the girls, but just the people. We have to keep in mind that many people are escaping from something. They also have a hope. And what happens on those boats is people they risk their lives to save themselves.
That question of the trafficking for sex purposes at the destination or even en route, as I think you would agree, many of them are abused en route. But at the destination, well, then the profits really start to roll in a disgusting way, because then the trafficked migrants are put to work, as we discovered from CNN's Isa Suarez.
On a bitterly cold October night, young women huddle over a stove, each one waiting patiently for men. In 2016, 11,000 Nigerian women arrived by sea in Italy, according to the International Organization for Migration, most of whom risk become victims of trafficking and prostitution in Europe. Meet 17-year-old Becky. She was one of them, and she came in search of the European dream.
I just wanted to look for a better life and a better future.
But she was tricked by a madame, a female Nigerian pimp who works for a trafficking ring.
Who pays?
She pays.
So she pays,
yeah,
but you're indebted to her. How much money do you need to pay her back?
35,000 €.
Together with 4 other girls, Becky's put on a dinghy to Italy. Now here, the reality of this transaction is clear.
This place will make money. You have to sleep with men. You are expected to bring 200 € back to your madam. Maybe if a man sleeps with you, the highest he can pay you is 30 €. Calculate how many men are you going to sleep with to get 200 €.
Becky was rescued, but there are many like her still trapped in this new slave trade of human trafficking and human misery.
I can hear viewers at home perhaps saying, look, they're on the streets there. Why don't they just go and knock on a church door? Why don't they just go to a police station and say, I can see you're shaking your head. You're looking at me like I'm mad.
For every girl you see out there, there's a pimp watching her. Someone is controlling these girls. They're not in control of themselves. They are all being trafficked, and they're making millions of euros from those girls.
Yeah. Every day, every week, Italian police, Italian investigation dismantle groups of those traffickers and liberate those young victims. But what happens? That the day after, others will join the traffic.
From where? From where? What's the route?
From where? Everywhere. Africa, Asia, Balkans, Moldova, Ukraine.
Many of these girls are sold on internet. They actually are not even on the streets. So you don't see them, Richard. They are not necessarily visible to the public.
As we continue, we've talked about the sex trafficking aspect of this, but then there is the simple labor question. Forced labor, slave labor, which needs to be addressed. The need for labour in the European Union, in any of the advanced economies, is quite extraordinary. There's simply not enough people in the countries themselves who are prepared to do half the jobs that other people want. That creates a demand for migrant workforce, which then creates the opportunity for people to be trafficked. Would you agree?
Yes, there are good laws opening the doors for a legal labor market. Those laws are not implemented. There is still too much tolerance vis-à-vis black labor market. There is a pull factor In Italy, every year in the autumn, people that are used as slaves to pick up tomatoes in the south of Italy, these are also slaves, but this cannot be tolerated by Europe as a whole. It's not a problem of Italy, it's an European issue.
Does there need to be a change in laws, not just in this country, which obviously you're an expert in, but in other countries?
There should be a change on the implementation of existing laws. Zero tolerance vis-à-vis those that are recruiters and employers that use those people $1, €1 per day. This is a slavery.
The laws are there, but they are not being implemented.
No implementation.
Because the demand for cheap labor in the destination countries is very high.
Yeah.
So they look the other way.
Who
You go
looks
to
the
the
other way?
hotels, the destination countries, they look the other way.
Employers.
Because if you go to the hotels, you go to the restaurants, you see immigrants there.
Yeah.
Where did they come from? How did they come? How are they paid? Who do they pay? They pay to labor agencies, cheap labor agencies. That's what they do.
Correct.
And they know they exist, but they do nothing about it.
Who's responsible for implementation then?
The laws are there. Implementation is hugely difficult, and prosecution is a mighty challenge, as Mr. Frattini was saying. Gathering evidence in order to gain a conviction is extremely difficult. So clearly this is an area where more resources are needed.
I do not agree that prosecution is difficult, but they refuse to prosecute the criminal gangs in the destination countries.
Why?
I don't know why. Maybe they are protecting them. Because, for example, when they give us evidence about the criminal gangs that are Nigerian citizens, we prosecute them and we convict them. We've been able to get 333 convictions so far. How many criminal network gangs have been prosecuted in the destination countries? How many bank accounts have been frozen? How many assets have been confiscated?
It is not true, absolutely. In Italy, no prosecutors refuse to prosecute. Please.
Can you give us figures of how many criminal gangs have been prosecuted
I will give you
that
figures.
come from the
I will
destination
give you
countries?
figures.
Please tell
Many
us.
Italian judges are losing their life to prosecute criminals and organized crime, me included. So please don't say that Italian prosecutors don't do. They do.
If that's the case, if that is the case that there are prosecutions, why are we failing to make progress?
Unfortunately, there are in some cases not enough evidence. When there are evidence, for sure they are dismantled, they are put in jail. But as you just said, in many cases we cannot put in jail if we don't have full evidence.
I guess I could sum up the challenge by reminding everyone that this is a clandestine business. And we have similar problems, the international community has similar problems with dealing with similarly organized clandestine businesses. The arms trade, the drugs trade.
There is also another part of the story, and it's prevention. When these kids actually end up on the street, it's responsibility of the country or of the city and of all its citizens to ensure. You know, we have ratified all the countries except one UN Convention of the Right of the Child. There shouldn't be a child that's not going to school, doesn't have a home, doesn't have access to healthcare. There shouldn't be a citizen that is seeing such a child and not reacting. So yes, the traffickers is one thing, then we have the demand. So how do we deal with the people who are buying these services? And how do we, as society, accept that my neighbor has slaves?
When we come back, we have shown you the scale of the problem and we have nibbled at the solutions. But the panel has to address one serious question after the break. European voters are angry. Anti-immigration parties are on the rise. And in a deteriorating situation, who can blame them? So we're delighted and honoured to have with us this evening the Under-Secretary of the Premier, Sandro Gotti, who joins us. This issue, sir, this issue of necessity to stop this illegal immigration has its roots in politics, doesn't it?
Well, certainly has its roots in the need to take control. The main reason why anti-European xenophobic parties are rising in Europe is because national policies show that they are not in control of the migratory flows. To get back control, you need to develop new European policies and new approaches and new agreement on the border between Europe and especially the transit countries.
But you'd agree that these arrangements have to be seen as temporary at best, and because the downside is a right-wing anti-immigrant that's on the rise in Europe.
The issue is to take away incentive to those who develop the traffic business and to those who cooperate with the traffic business. But there's another point which raised, we need to strengthen cooperation with the country of origin, not to blame each other.
Absolutely. Most of the time we have a problem with truthful information, transparent information, and full disclosure. When we give all the information that is required, we do not get the reciprocal thing coming from the countries of destination. This trust is not there. We should have joint operations. We should have joint investigations, mutual legal assistance, but all of this is missing.
So why don't we?
There's been progress. Look, I don't want to sound wishy-washy about that and to give the impression that there are great solutions on the way. But I think we've got to acknowledge that there is progress. There's greater cooperation now since the crisis between Europe and Africa.
That greater cooperation is based on political fear in the countries of Europe.
Let me put that in perspective. There is fear, and that's one of the drivers, but let's also make it clear that some of that fear, at least, is based on what I call myths of migration. There's a toxic narrative about migration that must be part of the deal. Migration is very often used as a scapegoat, the surrogate problem which is at the root of all economic problems of Europe or other countries. I think we've got to sort that out. Now, is migration an issue for the voter, the European voter? Of course it is. I think the electorate wants to be given the confidence that this thing called migration is managed. At the moment, they fear that it isn't. And part of it has to be an educational process.
Well, I think the way forward should be prevention and more prevention. In the first place, all of these are kind of reactive solutions. We need to prevent this thing from happening in the first place by creating awareness, and we need to also look at the destination countries and reduce the demand. The demand is what is driving the supply. Sex is cheap. Cheap labor, the demand for cheap labor is very high. The demand for child pornography is very high. They have a lot of sites on child pornography. I mean, they need to do something about all of this.
They need to do something about all of this, which brings us to you, sir, the Italian Under-Secretary of Justice. You've heard us this evening question the prosecutorial abilities, the level of evidence that is required in these cases, the seeming impotence of authorities, the judicial authorities in any country, not particularly Italy, but in any country, to deal with this problem. Why?
Now we have, for the last 1 year, a national plan against trafficking, protection, prosecution, partnership, and we have to prevent this kind of trafficking. We introduced new laws against the cheap labor, for example, against the exploitation of the labor in the countries. And we are proud to have a lot of people in jail trafficking. The problem is why people that can arrested by ourselves are not possible to send back in the Nigeria, for example, that are the majority. That's why it's really for us a problem. You're
talking about here the traffickers or the trafficked?
Traffickers.
The traffickers.
Rather than put them in prison here, you want to send them back?
The criminals.
Yeah.
So why not put them in prison here?
The criminals, because it's not just that we pay for those criminals.
Will you take them back? Will you take them back?
Yes, you see the point I've been trying to make. Now, they kind of restrict this to Italy. I'm not talking about Italy now. I'm talking about the destination countries. So you are taking it personal. I'm talking of destination countries, including Italy. The problem I have is when they talk about the traffickers, they only refer to the Nigerian traffickers. What about the Italian traffickers? What about the Spanish traffickers? Where are they? How many of them have been prosecuted? How many accounts have been fraud? That's what I'm asking.
I'm dealing with Italian traffickers, be sure.
Well, we need to share information. We need to share information.
We have to understand better each other. We have not to have a conflict between us because we are on the same side of the problem.
Yes, this is not a conflict.
But
no.
Really, I know that there is a lack of organization and European approach. For example, Italy proposes an European prosecutor, also for security of our countries. But it's true that we have, for example, almost 57,000 people in jail, and almost 20,000 are strangers, and almost 1/3 is coming from Nigeria, for example. And for us, it's difficult that for this criminal to have the send back, because I think that it's true that is necessary to arrest them.
Thank you, sir. We're not completely beating up on Nigeria alone.
No, it's fine. It's fine. You see, the point I'm trying to make is if you, for example, are going to repatriate a Nigerian trafficker, we in Nigeria need to know who were these traffickers also working with. Who were these Italian traffickers they were working with? But we never get that information. It always appears to be a Nigerian problem, but it is not a Nigerian problem.
I think what we need to remember that there isn't one answer, and you cannot address such a multifaceted problem with one solution. It's not just the traffickers. It's not just the governments. And we have not been focusing on how we could help the other side to prevent the problem from happening in the first place, and how we could strengthen our systems when we receive the migrants.
As we continue, for the final thoughts, is there a possibility that companies and corporations could play a greater role in stamping out human trafficking? We'll take that and the final thoughts in a moment. The issue of what we can all do to help prevent this. Well, there's one set of groups and actors and people, and that is large corporations and the role that they can play. And I see, Gervais, you're very much aware that potentially this is an untapped source where corporations are now getting involved.
Yes, indeed. And this is good news. I mean, there's more than a glimmer of hope in that direction. We've said all through this evening that one of the biggest problems underlying migrant trafficking is grey labor or black labor, demand for people who are exploited for their labor. And I think that the corporate leaders of the world are coming to realize that. And they are acknowledging now that there is very often a problem with their labor supply chains. They're conscious of that. And they're coming forward to speak to us and to speak among themselves to say that this has to be addressed.
Why are they doing it?
Well, I think in part it is because their stakeholders have come to realize that they have a responsibility, and I think that consumers have also a role to play there. Consumer education can lead to change if they insist on having goods that are produced by labor in decent working conditions.
You know, there are certain banks that actually follow transactions on credit cards, and if someone does their nail at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, they realize that this is not doing your nails or your hair. This is really human trafficking or buying drugs, doing illegal transactions. And then they really follow and help identify traffickers or gangs. So there are organizations or corporations that are taking on this.
This is an optimistic note upon which we can head towards the end of our discussion, that not only is there the possibility of cooperation between countries, but there's the possibility of private sector involvement. What for you is the most optimistic thought that you can leave us with in a sea of otherwise appalling behaviors?
We need to look at the source countries, the transit countries, the destination countries, and start with the awareness, raise awareness in all of those places. We need to look at the root causes. What are those factors that make irregular migration to thrive? What are those factors that also make trafficking to thrive in the destination countries? So if the destination countries address those factors and the origin, countries of origin address those factors, then I think we'll make a headway.
Gervais, give me some optimism.
Okay, first of all, I think we've spent the evening telling the world what a huge problem this is, and we really wanted to do that. It's a big problem. But I think there's reason for us to believe that we can tackle it by working together. I think there's definitely evidence, look forward, of governments now wanting to work together. That's number one. And secondly, I think that the business sector is not only becoming aware of it, but has a desire to tackle it. That's a second reason for hope.
Reason for hope?
The global commitment that all the countries signed, it's not the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it's all the nations and people's Sustainable Development Goals. And the private sector is very much dependent and engaged in the implementation and the achievement of those goals. We see already the private sector engagement with the government and the civil society. So my hope is that by raising global awareness about the consequences for the society and the cost to the society, the impact, economic impact of violence is $7 trillion.
Sir, we are honoured and delighted to be in your country and in your city.
Yep.
So I think it is only right and proper that we allow you to give us the final thoughts.
Yeah.
And the final moment of optimism and hope.
Everything was said about optimism is absolutely right. I'm not so optimistic, by the way. I would say the only way to succeed is to raise awareness. This is the only way to save the face of the richer part of the world. Otherwise, we should be aware that it's an untenable situation. We lose our moral face. It is a problem of humanity. It's not a problem of business. It's not a problem of making business or changing business. It's a human problem. It's a problem of recreating a humanism. In Italy, we created humanism centuries and centuries ago. Now it's time to create a humanism in the 21st century. This is the only way to succeed. Otherwise, we make a confusion between business and what is not business. This is humanity.
And there, on that optimistic note, the prospect of raising awareness, exactly the commitment of CNN with the Freedom Project to end modern-day slavery. Raising awareness, it's something we will continue to do wherever it's necessary. I'm Richard Quest. Good night from Rome.